Chapter 1. The Seeds of Conflict. The closing years of the 18th century were a storm gathering on the horizon, a time of rumblings beneath the surface, where tradition clashed with the thunder of new ideas. The French Revolution of 1789 had not just overthrown a monarchy, it had unleashed a force that would ripple across Europe and beyond. The cries for liberty, equality, and fraternity were not simply slogans, they were tectonic shifts in the political and social foundations of the continent. France, once the symbol of aristocratic elegance, had transformed almost overnight into a land of turmoil, idealism, and bloodshed. The revolution brought with it an end to the Ancien Regime, the old feudal order of kings, clergy, and privilege. In its place rose a republic built on the Enlightenment's radical notions that all men were equal under the law, and that sovereign power came from the people, not divine right. But revolution is rarely a gentle teacher. France descended into internal strife, power struggles, and eventually the Reign of Terror. Yet amid this chaos, a new star emerged, a young artillery officer from the island of Corsica. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was born in 1769, just after France acquired Corsica from the Republic of Genoa. The young Bonaparte grew up resentful of French rule, but ambitious and gifted. He studied military strategy, devoured history, and understood the language of power. By the time he was in his 20s, he had become a general in the Revolutionary Army.
The world is not kind to those who wait. I will shape it with my own hands.
And shape it he did. In 1796, he led a brilliant campaign in Italy that astonished even his critics. Then, in 1799, with France once again in political turmoil, Napoleon staged a coup d'etat, declaring himself first consul. Within 5 years, he would take a crown and place it on his own head, proclaiming himself Emperor of the French. Europe watched in alarm. The monarchies of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia had barely come to terms with the French Revolution. Now they faced a far greater threat, a revolutionary general with imperial ambitions, commanding the most disciplined army on the continent. Coalitions formed swiftly, alliances once unthinkable took shape. Britain, ever wary of French expansion, poured gold into Europe to fund resistance. Austria, humiliated by earlier defeats, prepared once more for war. Russia and Prussia eyed Napoleon with suspicion, fearful that the wildfire of revolution might reach their own palaces.
He threatens not only peace, but the very structure of Europe. If we do not act now, there may be no turning back.
Napoleon, meanwhile, saw himself as the architect of a new Europe, one freed from the decay of old thrones and bound instead by law, reason, and French leadership. He envisioned a continent united not by swords alone, but by ideals and civil codes. To him, war was not just a tool of conquest, it was a path to transformation. But ideals, no matter how lofty, often fall into the shadows cast by ambition. As France expanded under Napoleon's command, the line between liberator and conqueror blurred. Nations that once welcomed French troops as harbingers of change soon chafed under the burdens of occupation, conscription, and heavy taxation. Thus, by the early 1800s, Europe stood on the brink of a new kind of war, one that would not merely shift borders, but shake the very foundations of political power, identity, and nationhood. It was a war of ideas and empires, of revolutions and restorations. It was the beginning of what history would remember as the Napoleonic Wars. In the chapters to come, we will follow the rise and fall of Napoleon Bonaparte, not merely as a conqueror, but as a man, a symbol, and a catalyst for change that still echoes through history. Chapter 2, The Road to Glory, tested general, clever, ambitious, and utterly fearless. His rise from relative obscurity to national fame began with a campaign that would change not only his life, but the fate of France. It was 1796. France, reeling from the revolution, was at war with a coalition of European monarchies determined to extinguish its new republican flame. While larger French armies battled in Germany and along the Rhine, a secondary force was sent to the Italian front. Few expected much from this theatre. The army was ragged, poorly supplied, and demoralized. But it had one advantage: Napoleon Bonaparte.
Soldiers, you are hungry and naked. The government owes you much, it can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities, honor, glory, and wealth shall be yours.
With that promise, Napoleon began the Italian campaign, a whirlwind of maneuver, speed, and psychological warfare. He moved faster than his Austrian enemies, outwitting them again and again. In a matter of weeks, he had defeated armies twice his size, capturing Milan and forcing the Austrians into a humiliating retreat. His victories at Lodi, Arcole, and Rivoli were not just tactical triumphs, they were legends in the making. Soldiers who had doubted him became loyal followers. France, hungry for heroes, celebrated him as the Republic's savior.
Bonaparte the young lion, our shining sword in Italy, long live the general.
Yet even as he was defeating enemies abroad, Napoleon was consolidating power at home. He understood the art of publicity, sending carefully worded dispatches back to Paris, shaping his image as both a brilliant general and a devoted servant of the revolution. Flush with success, the Directory, the ruling executive of France, gave him a new mission to lead an expedition to Egypt. It was a bold gamble. The goal was not only to strike at British trade routes, but to plant French influence in the East. In 1798, Napoleon set sail for Egypt with a fleet of ships, thousands of troops, and a retinue of scientists and artists, the finest minds France had to offer. His ambition was not merely military. He sought to bring Enlightenment ideals to ancient lands.
We have come to restore the rights of the people. We are friends to Islam and to the noble traditions of Egypt.
But Egypt proved a more complex challenge. While Napoleon defeated the Mamluk forces at the Battle of the Pyramids, his navy suffered a crippling blow. At the Battle of the Nile, British Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed most of the French fleet, stranding Napoleon and his army in North Africa. Still, Napoleon pressed on, campaigning in Syria, defeating enemies in brutal desert battles, and engaging in diplomacy with local leaders. But sickness, supply shortages, and British pressure wore his forces down. In 1799, sensing France's political instability and fearing he might be forgotten, Napoleon made a bold decision. He abandoned his army and secretly returned to France. It was a gamble, and it paid off. France, worn out by years of war, was in chaos once more. The Directory was weak, the people were disillusioned. Napoleon, now a national hero, seized the moment.
He's back, and the people love him still.
In November of 1799, Napoleon led a coup d'état, dissolving the Directory and establishing the consulate. He declared himself first consul of France. Though the revolution had been about ending monarchy, the people welcomed strong leadership. They saw in Napoleon a man who could bring order, victory, and prosperity. His path was clear now. He had conquered abroad and outmaneuvered rivals at home. The road to glory stretched before him, not just as a general, but as the master of France. Chapter 3. Empire against Empire. Europe was once again on the edge of war. The fragile peace signed at Amiens had collapsed, and tensions between France and Britain reignited. Across the continent, old enemies sharpened their swords. Monarchs whispered warnings about Napoleon's growing power, while revolutionaries cheered his reforms. The world was dividing between the old order and the new empire. At the heart of it all stood Napoleon Bonaparte, no longer simply first consul. In 1804, he took a bold and symbolic step. In a ceremony drenched in drama and defiance, he crowned himself Emperor of the French, not by papal blessing, but by his own hand.
I am the child of the revolution, and now I am its master.
The coronation stunned Europe. The Pope was present, but powerless. By placing the crown on his own head, Napoleon made it clear his authority came not from divine right, but from victory, from vision, and from the will of the people. But across the Channel, Britain remained implacable. Prime Minister William Pitt saw Napoleon not as a stabilizing force, but as a tyrant in revolutionary clothing. He began forging a new alliance of powers to stop France's expansion. The result was the Third Coalition, a formidable union of Britain, Austria, Russia, and eventually Sweden and Naples.
He seeks not peace, but dominion. He must be resisted, or Europe will fall under his boot.
In 1805, Austria mobilized its army and marched toward Bavaria, hoping to preempt a French attack. Russia moved west to support its ally. But Napoleon was already in motion. With dazzling speed, he moved his Grande Armée, some 200,000 strong, from the English Channel to southern Germany. What followed was one of the most brilliant campaigns in military history. The Ulm campaign was a masterclass in maneuver. French forces surrounded the Austrian army without a major battle, forcing General Mack to surrender nearly 30,000 men at the fortress of Ulm. It was a bloodless triumph, one that opened the road to Vienna. Yet the crowning moment of the campaign was still to come. On December 2nd, 1805, the anniversary of his coronation, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Russia and Austria near the village of Austerlitz. Outnumbered and outflanked, he executed a plan of stunning deception. Finding weakness on his right flank, he lured his enemies into overextending.
Tomorrow we shall end this war with a thunderbolt. Trust in me and strike where I command.
The trap was sprung. As Russian and Austrian forces moved to exploit the supposed weakness, Napoleon unleashed a devastating assault on their center, splitting the coalition army in two. The fog of morning lifted just in time to witness history being made. The result was a crushing victory. Over 30,000 coalition troops were killed, wounded, or captured. The Holy Roman Empire, already teetering, collapsed in the aftermath. Francis II would abdicate the imperial throne the following year, dissolving an institution that had lasted nearly 1,000 years.
The empire gone, all that tradition vanished in a single day. What is left now?
Austerlitz was more than a battle. It was the pinnacle of Napoleon's power, the moment when all of Europe seemed to bend to his will. He redrew maps, installed allies and relatives on thrones, and spread the Napoleonic Code across the continent. Roads, universities, and legal systems were reformed in his image. Yet for all his glory, Napoleon had also awakened powerful enemies. Russia burned for revenge, Britain increased its naval pressure, nationalist movements stirred in conquered lands. Even as the emperor basked in triumph, the next war was already brewing in the distance, on the seas, in the hills of Spain, and in the vast frozen wilderness of Russia. Chapter 4. The War of Gold and Blockades. Ossus. Kingdoms fell, empires bowed, and the map of the continent bent to his will. But one enemy remained defiant, unyielding, unbroken, and ever-present: Great Britain. The British had no interest in continental conquest. Their battlefield was the sea, and their greatest weapon was the Royal Navy. While Napoleon's armies marched through cities and fields, British ships ruled the oceans, disrupting French trade, supporting rebellions, and pouring gold into the hands of Europe's resistance.
We may not beat him on land, but he shall never take the sea. As long as we command the waves, the fight is ours.
Napoleon knew he could not invade Britain. The English Channel was a watery fortress, protected by fleets that had humiliated the French and Spanish navies at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. So he turned to a different strategy: economic war. In 1806, from the Palace of Berlin, Napoleon issued the Continental System, a decree banning all European ports under French control from trading with Britain. His goal was to strangle British commerce, to choke its industry, and to force its submission through isolation.
If I cannot beat them with bayonets, I shall defeat them with tariffs. Britain's wealth is her lifeblood. Cut it off, and her power will fade.
At first, the plan seemed bold and ingenious. France and her allies controlled much of Europe's coastline. If no one on the continent could buy British goods, the empire of merchants would falter. But Britain adapted. With its naval superiority, it found new markets overseas, in the Americas, in India, and across the seas. British merchants smuggled goods into Europe through neutral ports and corrupt officials. Iron, cloth, sugar, and tea still made their way onto the streets of Paris and Vienna, only now, at higher prices and with greater risk.
British cotton, Spanish tobacco, everyone still wants them. And where there is demand, there is always supply.
Meanwhile, the continental system began to backfire. The economies of occupied Europe suffered. Port cities like Hamburg, Naples, and Amsterdam, once bustling with trade, withered under the embargo. Farmers and artisans struggled to sell their goods. Markets dried up. Discontent festered. Napoleon responded with ever stricter enforcement. He expanded the system, forced allies into compliance, and punished those who resisted. When Portugal refused to close its ports to Britain, he ordered the invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, dragging Spain and Portugal into a brutal, drawn-out conflict. Even Russia, initially an enforcer of the blockade, began to chafe under the economic strain. Tsar Alexander I, whose empire depended heavily on British trade, grew restless. Tensions simmered between Paris and St. Petersburg until they would one day boil over into war. The continental system had one other flaw: it made Napoleon more enemies than it hurt. Neutral nations like the United States were outraged by French interference in maritime trade. Denmark and Sweden resented being strong-armed into compliance. Napoleon's empire, once admired for its reforms and efficiency, began to look more and more like a tyrannical machine. The war of bayonets had paused, but in its place came a war of hunger, recession, and resentment, a slow strangulation that wore down the morale of Napoleon's allies and subjected Europe to grinding hardship.
Trade is the soul of peace, and peace has fled from us.
Napoleon had tried to conquer Britain without firing a shot across the Channel. But in doing so, he weakened his grip on the very continent he had sought to unite. The seeds of rebellion were beginning to sprout in the fields of Spain, in the court of the Tsar, and in the hearts of once loyal citizens. Soon, the emperor would find himself fighting fires across Europe, and the greatest blaze of all was about to ignite in the east. Chapter 5: The Road to Moscow. By 1811, Napoleon was still at the height of his power, but the edges of his empire were beginning to fray. The continental system was cracking, discontent was rising in occupied territories, and most critically, an old ally was turning into a dangerous enemy: Russia. After the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I had shared an uneasy peace. But it was a fragile understanding, held together by ambition and distrust. The Tsar had agreed to enforce the continental system, but over time it became clear that Russia's vast economy could not thrive under Napoleon's trade restrictions.
Our merchants grow poorer, the people angrier. This alliance starves us. Britain remains open, but France closes every gate.
By 1810, Alexander had resumed trade with Britain, openly defying Napoleon. The emperor was furious. He believed the Tsar's betrayal must be punished, not just to save the blockade, but to reassert French dominance over all of Europe.
He has broken faith. I will march to Moscow and remind him why France rules.
So began one of the most ambitious military operations in history. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon assembled the Grande Armée, a force of over 600,000 soldiers from every corner of his empire. Germans, Poles, Italians, Austrians, and Frenchmen all gathered under one banner. It was the largest army Europe had ever seen. Crossing the Niemen River in June, they entered Russian territory. But the Russians did not meet them in open battle. Instead, they retreated, burning fields, villages, and supplies as they went. It was a strategy of deliberate devastation, drawing the French deeper into hostile territory.
If we cannot have our land, neither shall they. Let it burn.
Napoleon pressed on, confident in his strategy. Yet the deeper his army marched, the longer the supply lines stretched. Heat, dust, and hunger began to sap morale. Disease spread, horses collapsed, ammunition dwindled. But still, Napoleon advanced toward Moscow, toward vengeance. At last, on September 7th, the Russians made their stand at Borodino. The battle was a brutal and bloody clash. Over 70,000 men fell in a single day. Napoleon claimed victory, but it was a hollow one. The Russian army was battered but not destroyed, and the road to Moscow lay open. On September 14th, Napoleon entered the ancient city, but instead of peace or surrender, he found silence. The Russian government had fled, and soon fires erupted, engulfing the city in flames.
Moscow burns and we have no victory.
Napoleon waited. Weeks passed. There was no delegation, no treaty. Winter crept closer. Supplies ran low. His men began to die in the cold. The emperor faced a terrible truth. He could not hold the city. He would have to retreat. The journey back was a nightmare. Temperatures dropped below 30 degrees Celsius. Frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion claimed thousands. Russian Cossacks harried the columns day and night, striking like ghosts. Men ate their horses. Cannons were abandoned. Discipline collapsed.
They froze where they stood. Whole regiments turned to ice. I prayed for death to come swiftly.
By the time the shattered remnants of the Grande Armée crossed back into friendly territory in December, fewer than 100,000 men remained. Of the original 600,000, the rest were dead, captured, or missing. It was a catastrophe unlike any Napoleon had ever known. The emperor who had once been invincible was now wounded, his myth shattered by frost and fire, and the rest of Europe smelled weakness. The road to Moscow had been a march of pride. The road back was a trail of ghosts. Chapter 6: The 100 Days, Eled. In April 1814, After a string of defeats and the occupation of Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte surrendered his crown and was sent into exile on the tiny island of Elba in the Mediterranean. Europe exhaled. Kings returned to their thrones. The long war, it seemed, was over. Elba was small, but Napoleon remained restless. Though he governed the island with remarkable energy, building roads, improving agriculture, and reforming the administration, he could not ignore what was happening in France. His ears, through secret messengers, remained pressed to the continent.
They think France has forgotten me, but the throne sits uneasily beneath a Bourbon. The people remember.
The restored monarchy of Louis XVIII struggled to win the hearts of a nation shaped by revolution and war. Royalist policies alienated the army, the middle class, and the veterans who had once marched under the imperial eagle. Meanwhile, rumors of Napoleon's return stirred across taverns and barracks.
They say he's on the move, that he still wears his uniform, still dreams of glory. Perhaps it is only talk, or perhaps he is coming.
On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba aboard a small brig with a few hundred loyal soldiers. 10 days later, he landed on the southern coast of France. His return set in motion one of the most extraordinary episodes in modern history. As he marched north toward Paris, troops were sent to arrest him, but instead of fighting, they defected. Again and again, soldiers who had once served him threw down their arms and rejoined their emperor.
If any man would shoot his emperor, here I stand.
No shots were fired. The men erupted in cheers. The monarchy fled. By the time Napoleon reached Paris, he had reclaimed his throne without firing a single musket. It was March 20th, 1815. The period that followed became known as the 100 Days. But Europe was watching. The Allied powers who had exiled him saw his return as a direct threat to the fragile peace they had so carefully brokered. Once again, coalitions formed. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia all mobilized their forces. Napoleon moved quickly. He knew his only chance lay in striking first before the Allies could fully unite. He chose Belgium as his battleground. There, near the small village of Waterloo, the fate of Europe would be decided. On June 18, 1815, under grey skies and soft mud, Napoleon's army faced off against the Anglo-Allied forces of the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army led by Field Marshal Blücher. The French fought fiercely, launching wave after wave against Wellington's lines.
Stand firm, lads. This ground we hold, or we hold nothing at all.
For hours, the battle teetered. Napoleon unleashed his elite imperial guard to deliver the final blow. But the British held. The Prussians arrived. The tide turned.
They are breaking, the guard is breaking. I never thought I'd see the day.
As dusk fell, the battlefield was a sea of bodies. Napoleon's army was routed. The dream was over. He fled the field, returned briefly to Paris, and then abdicated, this time for good. He was exiled once more, but now to a place from which he could not return, St. Helena, a remote, windswept island in the South Atlantic. There, far from the continent he had once ruled, Napoleon would spend the final years of his life, dictating memoirs, walking among rocky cliffs, and reflecting on the world he had tried to reshape. The 100 Days had been a flicker of past glory, a bold, breathtaking return that ended in the mud and thunder of Waterloo. Europe, exhausted, turned once more to peace. 7. The Emperor in exile. St. Helena was a world away, literally and figuratively, from the palaces, battlefields, and marble halls of Napoleon's past. A volcanic outcrop in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, it was remote, windswept, and inhospitable. There would be no return from here. The Emperor had reached the end of his road. On October 15, 1815, Napoleon arrived on the island under British guard. No longer a ruler, he was referred to only as General Bonaparte by his captors. They feared even the idea of him. Europe, still shaken by his dramatic return during the 100 Days, demanded a final, unbreakable exile.
St. Helena, 6,000 miles from Paris. No friends, no allies, no escape.
The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, was a rigid man, dutiful, suspicious, and determined to prevent Napoleon from becoming a martyr or regaining influence. Their relationship soured almost immediately. Letters were censored, visitors were limited, and every movement of the exiled emperor was monitored. Still, Napoleon retained his dignity. He lived at Longwood House, a damp, draughty residence perched high on a windswept plain. There he walked in the gardens, played cards with his loyal followers, and dictated his memoirs to those who had chosen exile alongside him.
They say I brought only war, but history will say otherwise. I gave Europe laws, reason, and light. Let them read.
With the same intensity that once fueled his campaigns, Napoleon now turned inward, into the past, into memory. He composed detailed accounts of his battles, his thoughts on government, and his version of history. He shaped his legacy, not through cannon and cavalry, but through words. He portrayed himself as a man of the people, a child of the revolution, a builder of nations. He painted the monarchs who defeated him as cowards clinging to the past, and himself as a visionary ahead of his time.
He writes not of conquest, but of unity, not of ambition, but of destiny.
But exile wore on him. The once indomitable man grew ill. The island's damp climate affected his health, and many believed the loneliness gnawed at his spirit more than any illness. By 1820, he began suffering intense abdominal pain. The cause remained uncertain. Some whispered poison. Others suggested stomach cancer, which had claimed his father. The emperor's health deteriorated rapidly.
We can ease his suffering, but the end is not far.
On May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, Napoleon Bonaparte died. In his final hours he whispered of France, of the army, of Josephine. His last words were a string of half-formed thoughts, dreams clinging to a man who once ruled continents. He was buried on the island, in a simple grave marked only by a stone. The British would not even allow the word emperor to be inscribed on the monument. But death could not bury his memory. In 1840, nearly 2 decades later, his remains were returned to France. Paris wept. The crowds lined the streets. His body was placed beneath the great dome of Les Invalides, a resting place worthy of kings. Napoleon, who had risen from obscurity to command the destiny of nations, who had been feared, adored, reviled, and revered, now lay in the heart of the country he had reshaped forever. Chapter 8, Echoes of an Empire, vilified and defeated, had also transformed the world, and the echoes of his empire resound to this day. Though his reign ended in military defeat, Napoleon's impact extended far beyond the battlefield. Across the lands he once ruled, from the Pyrenees to the Vistula, he had imposed order, law, and modernity. His greatest weapon had not been the cannon or the bayonet, but the code.
The Napoleonic Code. It was revolutionary. Equality before the law, secular justice, civil rights, all enshrined and spread across Europe. Even today, its structure forms the backbone of legal systems from Belgium to Latin America.
His administrative reforms reshaped how nations functioned. He modernized taxation, streamlined education, and built institutions designed to serve the state rather than the monarch. Under Napoleon, the ideal of merit, of rising through talent rather than birth, was not merely preached, but practiced. Militarily, Napoleon revolutionized warfare. His use of corps-based armies, fast movement, concentrated strikes, and integrated artillery changed the way wars were fought. Future generals, from Moltke to Patton, would study his campaigns like sacred texts.
He fought with brilliance and brutality, yes, but he also taught generals to think in terms of entire nations, not just armies, to see war as an extension of politics, identity, and purpose.
His legacy was also cultural. Napoleon became a mythic figure in art, poetry, and legend. He was the brooding conqueror of Beethoven's imagination, the tragic hero of Byron's pen, the embodiment of romantic ambition and fatal genius. Yet Napoleon's influence was not purely institutional or martial. He changed how the world viewed power. Before him, kings ruled by blood and inheritance. After him, rulers, whether emperors, presidents, or dictators, claimed legitimacy through charisma, vision, and action. He was the blueprint of the modern strongman.
Bonaparte showed that a single man, guided by will and intellect, could alter the course of history. He proved that greatness is not inherited, it is seized.
But power, once seized, demands a price. Napoleon's wars left millions dead. His ambitions shattered empires, displaced peoples, and brought suffering across continents. To some, he was a tyrant in revolutionary disguise. To others, a liberator who awakened nations from feudal sleep. In Italy and Germany, his conquests sowed the seeds of unification. In Latin America, his weakening of Spain helped trigger independence movements. Even in defeat, his example inspired men and women to seek something greater than themselves, an identity, a purpose, a homeland.
We remember Bonaparte. We do not follow an emperor, but a spirit, the spirit of self-determination, of destiny claimed.
He changed the world not just through what he built, but through what he represented. Ambition, genius, discipline, and the danger of all three when left unchecked. In the end, Napoleon's greatest legacy may be the lesson he leaves us: that power is a flame, capable of illuminating a generation or consuming it. His empire crumbled, his armies were defeated, but the ideas he set loose, order, meritocracy, nationalism, identity, became permanent features of the modern age. He did not just rule an era, he defined it. Chapter 9. The Man Behind the Myth. Strip away the uniforms, the maps, the medals, and the myths, and what remains is a man, not a god of war or a monster of ambition, but a man of contradictions. Napoleon Bonaparte, the son of Corsica, the heir of revolution, the shaper of nations, and the prisoner of his own legend, calculating the movements of battalions and the emotions of crowds alike.
He could be silent for hours, then suddenly dazzle us with insight. You always felt the room was his, even when he said nothing at all.
Napoleon's ambition was elemental. He believed in destiny, not as myth, but as fact. From an early age, he spoke of greatness not with hope, but with certainty. He did not rise through fortune alone. He climbed with fire in his heart, intellect in his hand, and timing on his side.
I was born when Caesar died. Perhaps I was meant to finish what others only dreamed.
He was both a servant and master of the revolution, using its ideals to climb, then reshaping them to suit his empire. He claimed to be a man of the people, yet crowned himself emperor. He spread liberty, but demanded obedience. He believed in merit, yet installed his brothers as kings. To his soldiers, he was a legend come alive. He marched with them, shared their dangers, knew their pain. He called them his children, and they would die for him without question.
When he rode past, your heart burned. You knew this was no ordinary man. He was destiny in boots.
Yet he was also vain, suspicious, and increasingly distant as power grew. He exiled those who opposed him, silenced dissent, and allowed ego to cloud judgment. In Russia, in Spain, in his final campaigns, it was not his genius that failed, but his belief in his own infallibility. As a lover, he was complicated. He adored Josephine, though he divorced her for political reasons. His letters to her were tender, passionate, often desperate, but he also betrayed her, as he did others, when it suited him.
Since I left you, I have been constantly depressed. My happiness is to be near you.
His contradictions were never weaknesses, they were human. And that is what endures. He was not perfect, he was not evil, he was something rarer, real. A man who rose from a small island to change the world, and paid the price for it. In his final years on St. Helena, stripped of power and surrounded by sea, he reflected not only on the battles he had won, but on the man he had become.
I closed the abyss of anarchy, I cleansed the revolution of its crimes, I inspired a generation. But I could not outrun history. No man can.
To understand Napoleon is to understand the fragile line between brilliance and hubris, between leadership and domination. He stands as a mirror to the human condition, our potential, our flaws, and our desire to leave a mark upon the world. And though his empire fell, though time swept away his armies and monuments, the world he touched was never the same. Because behind every myth there is a man, and behind this man there was a vision, brief, brilliant, and eternal. Epilogue: The Tempest and the Torch. History remembers few names with such weight. Fewer still leave behind a legacy that bends across centuries, across continents, across hearts. Napoleon Bonaparte was one such name, a man who shaped his time, and in doing so, shaped ours. The Napoleonic Wars were not just battles, they were convulsions of a world in transformation. Old monarchies fell, new ideologies rose, borders shifted, and identities awakened. It was a time of cannons and constitutions, of glory and grief. Napoleon stood at the center of it all, a force of nature with a map in one hand and a law book in the other. He believed in order, in merit, in destiny, and wielded them like weapons. To some, he was the defender of Enlightenment ideals. To others, the usurper of liberty in an imperial crown.
Others call it pride.
But no single chapter can define him. No verdict can contain him. He was conqueror and reformer, tyrant and visionary, emperor and exile. And like all great figures, he forces us to confront ourselves, what we admire, what we fear, and what we become when given power. The world he left was not the one he inherited. The tides of nationalism, secular governance, and modern statecraft flowed from the changes he made. Even in defeat, he remained a point of reference for leaders, rebels, and dreamers alike.
He walked through fire, and though he burned many, the light remains.
In the end, the Napoleonic Wars were not just about one man's ambition. They were about the tension between chaos and control, between revolution and tradition, between the fleeting force of war and the enduring power of ideas. And that is Napoleon's greatest legacy, not what he conquered, but what he awakened. A Europe forced to reckon with modernity. A world taught that greatness is not inherited, but earned, and that the pursuit of glory comes at a cost. So let us remember him, not just as a man of war, but as a man of vision, not just as a ruler of men, but as a reflection of mankind itself. The tempest has passed, but the torch he carried still flickers in the winds of history.